My wife falsely accused me of assaulting our daughter based on a dream, but our security cameras revealed the truth. That day felt like any other. I came home from work, tired but not exhausted, just looking forward to relaxing on the couch. It was an ordinary weekday, nothing special. As I entered the house, everything seemed normal. My wife was napping on the couch, which was unusual since she rarely sleeps during the day. I assumed she must have had a tough day. Beside her, our 6-month-old daughter lay awake, wriggling slightly. I approached, planning to greet them and maybe take my daughter to her room to play while my wife rested. That's when I noticed the familiar smell of a dirty diaper. I guessed my wife was too tired to have changed her yet, so I decided to handle it myself. I didn't want to wake her since she works hard, and if she was napping, she probably needed the rest. I picked up our daughter and brought her to her room to change her. It was just part of our usual routine, nothing out of the ordinary. After laying her down on the changing table, I started getting the wipes and a fresh diaper ready. I had barely begun when I heard footsteps behind me. I assumed my wife had woken up and come to check on us, so I turned around, ready to greet her and maybe joke about her getting some rare rest. But before I could say anything, she came at me with a look of pure rage, as if I had done something terrible. She started screaming at me, not just raising her voice, but full-on shouting, "How could you?" over and over. I was completely bewildered, frozen for a moment as I tried to comprehend what was happening. My mind raced, trying to make sense of her words, but before I could respond, she began hitting me, really hitting, not just shoving. Everything happened so quickly, I was at a loss for how to react. My first concern was our daughter, still lying on the changing table. I instinctively leaned over her, trying to shield her from my wife's blows. I didn't even think about defending myself. My only thought was to keep our baby safe. My wife continued shouting, calling me a monster, but her accusations made no sense. I focused on blocking her strikes and protecting our daughter, all the while wondering, what did I do? What is she accusing me of? Eventually, she stormed out of the room, leaving me there in shock, gripping the edge of the changing table, trying to steady my breath and slow my pounding heart. I had no idea what had just unfolded. 1 minute, I was simply changing a diaper, and the next I was being attacked like I had committed some unspeakable act. About 5 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. At first, I thought my wife might have come back to talk, but instead it was the police 3 officers standing on the porch. It felt surreal, like a bad dream. I hadn't fully processed what had happened, and now I was facing police officers. They informed me that I was being arrested, but I was still too shocked to understand why. My wife stood behind them, crying hysterically, accusing me of hurting our daughter. I kept asking, "What are you talking about?" but she ignored me, repeating over and over that she had witnessed me doing something to our child. I could hardly believe what was unfolding. They handcuffed me right there outside our home and took me down to the station. That night in the cell was the longest of my life. Sleep was impossible. I just sat there, trying to make sense of it all. How had my wife gone from napping peacefully on the couch to accusing me of something so unthinkable? Why was she acting this way? My mind kept racing, replaying everything that had happened, desperately searching for what might have triggered her reaction. I knew I had done nothing wrong, but it felt like my world was crumbling around me. The following day, the police reviewed footage from the baby monitor in our daughter's room. Thankfully, I had installed it some time ago, and it turned out to be my saving grace. The recording showed exactly what had happened: me walking in, picking up our daughter and taking her to change her diaper. There was nothing more to it. No inappropriate behavior, no harm, just a regular diaper change. That footage was all the evidence needed, and I was released. You might think I would have felt relief, but that wasn't the case. The reality that my wife had accused me of something so awful, something I would never even consider, shook me to my core. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How could she think I would hurt our child? How could she attack me, then call the police and paint me as some kind of monster? When I finally returned home after that dreadful night, the silence was deafening. Normally I'd hear my wife humming or the TV on, maybe the soft cooing of our baby, but now the house was eerily quiet. I hadn't anticipated just how drastically things had changed in less than 24 hours. I sat down on the same couch where my wife had napped the day before, where I had picked up our daughter, thinking it was just another routine day as a dad. Now everything felt stained by what had happened. The silence pressed down on me, making me feel like an outsider in my own home. As I sat there, replaying everything in my mind, my confusion began to shift into anger. How could she do this to me? How could she call the police on me like that? I hadn't done anything wrong, yet in her mind I was now this villain. She had turned my entire world upside down in just a few minutes. The woman I thought I knew better than anyone had suddenly become a stranger. Eventually, I picked up my phone, which I hadn't touched since this all began. I wasn't exactly eager to confront the world, but when I turned it on, I was bombarded with messages, missed calls, texts, everything, all from her. I didn't know where to begin, so I opened the first message I saw. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Can we please talk?" My blood boiled as I read those words. She didn't mean it. She had me arrested, left me fearing that my life was over, and now all she could say was that she hadn't meant it. As I continued scrolling through her messages, it was the same story: apologies, pleas to talk, suggestions that we try counseling. But there was never any real explanation. No reason for why she thought I'd harm our daughter, why she lashed out, or why she called the police. Just endless apologies. I stared at my phone, and for the first time since everything happened, I realized that I didn't love her anymore. I couldn't pinpoint when it happened, but something inside me had simply switched off. How could I trust her again? How could I stay with someone who believed I was capable of such a horrible act? I felt like I was sinking deeper into a pit of confusion and anger. My mind kept racing with the worst-case scenarios. What if we hadn't had that baby monitor? What if I couldn't prove my innocence? I'd still be sitting in that cell, my life completely shattered over a false accusation. That thought terrified me the most. If that camera hadn't been there, I didn't even want to think about what would have happened next. Then there were the messages from family and friends. They weren't making things any easier either, a flood of advice suggesting that maybe I was being too harsh, that perhaps we could work through this. They kept telling me to give her another chance, saying it was probably just a misunderstanding or that maybe she was overwhelmed as a new mom. Everyone seemed to have an excuse for her actions, but no one could tell me why she believed I'd harm our child. It felt like I had no one in my corner, not even my own family. They kept urging me to think about her feelings, suggesting that maybe she just made a mistake. But they hadn't lived through what I had. They didn't face the police at their door or spend the night in a cell, not knowing what the future held. After going through what felt like a mountain of messages, I tossed my phone aside, trying to clear my mind. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't shake the sense that my marriage was done. It wasn't just about feeling hurt or angry, it was the fact that I couldn't trust her anymore. Trust is the backbone of any relationship, right? Without it, what's left? I kept thinking about what to do next, and divorce seemed like the only real option. I couldn't imagine staying in a marriage where I'd always worry that my wife might accuse me of something else. I didn't want to live like that, and I definitely didn't want my daughter growing up in a household where her parents couldn't trust each other. The hardest part was that, even as I made up my mind to end things, I still didn't understand why it had all happened. It felt like a massive piece of the puzzle was missing. But I wasn't about to stick around to find out. Whatever drove her to act that way, it didn't change the fact that she crossed a line I couldn't forgive. I'd always wonder, what's next? What if she does it again? I couldn't live with that uncertainty, and I wouldn't. That evening I called my lawyer, explaining everything that had happened. I could hear the disbelief in his voice, but he agreed that divorce seemed like the best path forward given the situation. He also thought I had a good chance of getting full custody of our daughter, especially with the video evidence showing my wife's outburst. As I listened to him go over the legal aspects, I felt an odd sense of relief, not because things were getting easier, but because I was finally taking control of the situation. I wasn't just sitting around, waiting for things to worsen. I was making a choice, and it felt right. That night, as I lay in bed replaying everything in my head, there was a small sense of clarity. My marriage was over, and there was no going back. I wasn't happy about it, but I knew it was the only way forward. I had to prioritize my daughter and myself. I couldn't stay in a relationship where I didn't feel safe or trust the person who was supposed to be my partner. With that thought, I closed my eyes, knowing that the most difficult part was still ahead. A few days after speaking with my lawyer, the full weight of the situation really hit me. It wasn't just about the divorce anymore, it was about dealing with everything that came with it. Every time I checked my phone, there were more messages, family, friends, even people I hadn't heard from in years, but most of them weren't on my side. I had expected some support or at least a bit of understanding, but all I got was criticism. Everyone seemed to think I was overreacting. She made a mistake, they said. She's just overwhelmed. Think about your daughter, like I hadn't been thinking about her the entire time. That was what angered me, most people acting as if I was being reckless or selfish, like I wasn't doing this for my daughter too. I wanted to protect her from growing up in a dysfunctional environment, but no one seemed to grasp that. My mom called at least 3 times a day, She's always been the type to meddle, but this was a new level. Every call was the same, her urging me to forgive my wife, to give her a second chance, insisting that everyone makes mistakes. But she wasn't there. She didn't see how bad things got. She wasn't the one who had been falsely accused of something so horrible. I told her as much, but it didn't matter. It was like everyone had already decided that I was the one overreacting. Even my best friend Tom, who I thought would understand, started questioning me. One evening he came over, and as soon as he sat down, I knew where the conversation was headed. He looked at me for a moment before asking, "Man, are you sure you want to go through with this?" I just stared back, unsure if I should even bother responding. "Of course I'm sure. What other choice do I have?" he sighed, sounding almost disappointed. "I just feel like there might be more to it. Maybe she had a reason for freaking out. You know, new moms go through a lot. Maybe she wasn't in her right mind." That's when I lost it. Not in her right mind? She called the police on me, Tom. She told them I hurt our daughter when all I did was change her diaper. Do you think that's something I can just forget? He looked at me, his expression softening a bit. "I get it, man, but you have to ask yourself if this is worth tearing your whole family apart." I couldn't sit still anymore. I stood up, too angry to stay seated. She already tore it apart the second she accused me of something so horrible. Tom didn't have much to say after that, but it was clear he didn't agree with me. He left not long after, and I felt even more frustrated than before he arrived. It was as if everyone had forgotten what really happened. They were all so focused on keeping the peace, on trying to mend things, but no one seemed to care that I was the one blindsided by it all. After that, I tried to focus on my daughter. She was the only thing keeping me grounded. Every time I looked at her, I remembered why I was doing this. I wanted her to grow up in a safe environment, with parents who truly cared for her, not in a home where one of them had been falsely accused of harming her. It wasn't fair to her, and it wasn't fair to me either. But then came the next challenge, figuring out the custody situation. My lawyer was confident that I had a strong case for full custody, especially since the video evidence cleared me and captured my wife's violent outburst. But court outcomes are never a sure thing. Anything could happen. The possibility of the judge granting her joint custody, or worse, primary custody, haunted me. The idea of staying married to someone I couldn't trust was bad enough, but the thought of losing my daughter terrified me even more. What if the court didn't take my side? What if they saw it the way everyone else seemed to, thinking I was overreacting? What if they chose to believe her just because she was the mother? I knew how these things often when fathers don't always get a fair chance in court, regardless of the facts. To prepare, I started keeping records of everything, every text she sent, every call she made, every voicemail. I wasn't sure if it would make a difference, but I wanted to be ready. I needed to ensure that if things came down to it, I had proof that I wasn't exaggerating and that I hadn't done anything wrong. My wife tried to reach out to me several times, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I wasn't ready to speak to her, not after everything that had happened. Instead, I listened to her voicemails, which were full of apologies, requests for counseling, and claims that she didn't understand what had come over her. But none of it provided the answers I needed. Nothing she said explained why she had accused me in the first place, and that was the barrier I couldn't move past. I had no interest in counseling or trying to mend something that felt irreparably broken. I couldn't picture a future where I could ever trust her again, and without trust, what was left? Every time I thought about staying, I imagined constantly looking over my shoulder, always afraid of another outburst. I couldn't live like that, and I certainly wouldn't put my daughter in that kind of environment either. So I contacted my lawyer again and told him to proceed with the divorce. I wanted full custody, and I was ready to fight for it, no matter how many friends or family I might lose along the way. By then, I didn't care about their opinions. I had to prioritize my daughter and myself, even if no one else understood. And honestly, if they couldn't support me on this, maybe they didn't belong in my life anymore. The divorce process dragged on, and it wore me down. Every day felt like a new challenge, not just with my soon-to-be ex-wife, but with everyone around me. Friends, family, even co-workers all seemed to have their own ideas about what was best for me, my daughter, and my marriage. The more people weighed in, the more I wanted to shut them all out. I was beyond exhausted, constantly defending the only decision that made sense to me. I remember one particular night after putting my daughter to bed, I sat down at the kitchen table with a pile of documents from my lawyer, custody agreements, financial details, all the paperwork that comes with ending a marriage. As I stared at the legalese, my mind kept drifting back to how things used to be, how simple it all seemed before. Back when we first got married, I truly believed we had a solid relationship. Sure, we argued, but never about anything serious. I never imagined that we'd end up here with me trying to figure out how to separate our lives. It's crazy how quickly everything can change. One moment you think you have it all under control, and the next it's slipping away. I found myself thinking about this a lot, replaying how we got here. And every time I reached the same conclusion, I couldn't go back. I couldn't unsee what had happened. Even if I tried to move forward, the doubt would always be there. I'd constantly worry about whether she might have another outburst or make an even worse accusation, dragging us all through another nightmare. I couldn't live like that. It wouldn't be fair to me, and it certainly wouldn't be fair to our daughter. There were moments when I'd get messages or calls from her, and for a brief second I'd think, what if she truly had just been going through something? What if there was a reason behind it all, something I wasn't seeing? But then reality would hit me again. There was no excuse that could justify what she did, no explanation that could make it okay. A misunderstanding, that's what they were calling it now. I almost laughed but held back. I explained that I saw where she was coming from, but this wasn't something I could forgive. I tried to make her understand that the trust had been shattered, and without it, there was no marriage left to save. But she didn't seem to grasp it. She kept insisting that I was overreacting and not thinking about the long-term impact. That's when I lost my patience. "Look," I said firmly. "I know you want to defend your daughter, but this isn't something that an apology can fix. She accused me of something awful, and I can't live with that constantly looming over me. I have to focus on my daughter's future, and this is what's best for her." Her mother let out a frustrated sigh, then said, "But she's your wife. Don't you owe it to her to at least try?" That struck a nerve. I don't owe her anything after all she put me through. I did nothing wrong, yet I've had to manage the fallout of her actions ever since. I'm finished with this. After that, the conversation faded. Her mom wasn't pleased with my choice, but I refused to let her guilt me into changing my decision. I hung up the phone and sat for a while, trying to calm down. It felt like no one truly understood my perspective, no matter what I said. Everyone acted like this was a minor issue, something that could be brushed aside, but it wasn't. A few days later, my lawyer called with an update. The custody process was advancing, and based on what he shared, things looked positive for me. There was a strong possibility I'd gain primary custody, especially with the evidence of my wife's outburst. That brought some relief, but I knew the journey wasn't over yet. There was still a long road ahead, and I needed to prepare for whatever came next. One of the toughest parts of all this was keeping a sense of normalcy for my daughter. She's too young to grasp what's happening, but I could see she sensed the tension. She became fussy more often, sometimes crying without reason. I did my best to maintain her routine, but it was challenging when everything around us was crumbling. I remember those evenings with her, feeding her or playing with her toys, wondering what kind of life she would have growing up amid all this turmoil. It pained me to think about it. I didn't want her to grow up in a fractured home, but staying together just for appearances wasn't the solution either. I wanted her to be raised in a stable and secure environment, even if that meant doing it alone. As days went by, my focus shifted more toward that, ensuring my daughter's well-being, navigating the legal complexities, and moving forward. I stopped caring as much about others' opinions or remarks. It was evident that they didn't get it, and I wasn't willing to waste more energy trying to make them understand. At the end of the day, I knew what was right for me and my daughter, and that's what mattered. Others could think whatever they liked. As everything continued to progress, the reality of my choices hit me harder with each passing day. It was no longer just about signing documents or attending court sessions. It was about closing a chapter of my life I never imagined would end like this. But despite the difficulty, I believed I was making the right choice. Staying in a marriage where trust had completely collapsed was not an option. I spent a lot of time reflecting during those days, thinking back to when we first got married, how happy we were. We had dreams and plans for the future, typical things newlyweds talk about. We'd laugh at the thought of growing old together, watching our kids grow up, and traveling the world. In some ways, I was still grieving the loss of that version of us, the couple who believed they had it all figured out. But that version of us was long gone, with no way to bring it back. The messages from friends and family never really stopped, but I began replying less and less. Repeating myself became exhausting, like a broken record. People kept asking why I wouldn't give her another chance or whether I thought she deserved to explain herself. The truth was, she had her opportunities to explain, and she never did, not in a way that made sense, at least. All she ever offered was an apology. But an apology isn't enough when someone accuses you of something that could ruin your life. One afternoon, I sat in my daughter's room watching her play with her blocks. She had a huge smile, completely oblivious to everything happening around her. In that moment, I realized she was the reason I couldn't let myself get drawn back into the mess. I had to remain strong for her, avoiding the guilt trips and endless what-ifs others kept throwing at me. My role was to provide her with a stable life, no matter what. The next major event was the court hearing for custody. I won't lie, I was extremely nervous. I knew my case was solid, but there's always that lingering doubt, especially as a father. There's a sense that, no matter what, the system often leans toward the mother. It's not something people openly say, but it's always there in the back of your mind. When the day finally arrived, my anxiety was intense. I sat in the courtroom, waiting for the hearing to begin, and the reality of the situation hit me again. My wife sat across from me, looking anxious as well, but I couldn't muster any feelings about it. The part of me that would have cared about her emotions was gone. My only concern was the outcome. The hearing itself was fairly straightforward. My lawyer presented all our evidence, the video of her attacking me, the false accusations she'd made, and how she involved our daughter in everything. Her lawyer tried to minimize everything, as expected, citing how she was under stress and how being a new mother can affect emotions. But none of that justified the extreme action she took, accusing me of something so serious. When it was over, the judge awarded me primary custody, granting my wife supervised visitation. While I felt relieved, I wasn't exactly celebrating. This wasn't how I wanted things to be. I wanted my daughter to have both parents in her life, but not if it meant compromising her safety or raising her in a toxic environment. So while I was glad the court understood my perspective, it was a bittersweet victory. Leaving the courtroom that day, I experienced a strange mix of emotions. There was relief, sure, but it also felt like a burden had been lifted, the pressure from the divorce and the custody battle. It wasn't entirely over yet, but I could finally glimpse the light at the end of the tunnel. My wife tried reaching out a few more times afterward, mostly asking if we could work out a different custody arrangement, but I held firm I wasn't going to bend just because she felt regretful. It was too late to change anything now, and I wasn't willing to jeopardize my daughter's safety just to make things simpler for others. As time passed, life began to settle into a routine. I focused on maintaining a sense of normalcy for my daughter, aiming to make her life as stable as possible. She became my priority. I wanted her to have the best upbringing I could provide, one without chaos or uncertainty. Reflecting on everything that had happened, I saw how much I had grown throughout the entire ordeal. I used to be the kind of person who would avoid conflict at any cost, always wanting to maintain peace. But this situation made me stand up for myself and fight for what was right, even when it felt like the world was against me. I realized that doing the right thing doesn't always mean keeping everyone happy, and that's okay. In the end, I am confident that I made the best choice for myself and my daughter. It wasn't the life I had originally envisioned, but it was the life we had now, and I was committed to making the most of it. I stopped dwelling on others' opinions or whether they grasped my decisions. I knew what was right and wasn't about to let anyone cause me to second-guess myself. As for my wife, I honestly have no idea what lies ahead for her. I hope she gets the help she needs, whatever that may be, but I have let go of trying to repair things or understand why it all transpired. Some situations don't come with clear answers, and that's just how life is sometimes. Now, every night when I tuck my daughter into bed, I feel a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. It's just the two of us, and that's more than enough for me. Update: a few weeks after the court decision, I finally learned why my wife did what she did. To be honest, I had given up expecting any real explanation by then. I had already accepted that I might never fully comprehend what was going through her mind that day. But then, out of the blue one evening, I received a lengthy message from her. She explained that the entire accusation, everything that unfolded, stemmed from a dream. Yes, a dream. She described having a vivid nightmare where our daughter was harmed, and when she woke up and saw me changing her diaper, her mind somehow mixed up the dream with reality. Reading it, I was stunned, not sure how to react. A dream that was the cause of my entire life being upended. I sat there, staring at my phone, trying to wrap my head around it. It seemed unbelievable. We all have bad dreams, but for her to wake up and immediately act like it had happened, accusing me of something so vile based solely on a nightmare, was beyond comprehension. She apologized again in her message, but it no longer made a difference. The damage had already been done. It didn't matter that a dream had triggered her actions. She still called the police, she still lashed out at me, and she still made the decision to accuse me of something so terrible without pausing to think. I tried to imagine what she must have been feeling in that moment, but it still didn't excuse her actions. How could she not take a moment to calm down and realize it was only a dream? I couldn't fathom how anyone could confuse a nightmare with reality, especially to the extent of nearly tearing apart their family because of it. While her explanation clarified what had set her off, it didn't change my feelings. It didn't make things easier or less painful, in fact, it made me even more frustrated. How could she let a dream dictate her behavior like that? How could she even momentarily believe that I was capable of such a horrible act? I suppose she thought this was her way of offering me an explanation, but to me it only confirmed that we were finished. There was no repairing this, no amount of counseling or apologies could erase what she put me through, dream or not. Ultimately, the reason mattered far less than the outcome. Our marriage was over and my focus was on moving forward with my life, just me and my daughter.